March 1951, North Korea. The forces of South Korea, supported by men of the United Nations Command Force, are trying to hold their ground against a massive counterattack by the Chinese People's Volunteer Army and its North Korean allies. The Korean War is well into a second year of bloody conflict, a war that has already exacted a high price. The Korean War had begun 8 months earlier, on June 23, 1950. An initial attack by the NKPA, the Army of the North, and its communist leader, Kim Il-sung, had fallen just short of overwhelming the forces of the South and its pro-American leader, Syngman Rhee. The vital intervention of a force under the auspices of the United Nations Command, led by the United States, had halted the North Korean advance. When, in early November 1950, the UNC force pushed the Northern Army back over the 38th parallel into North Korea and threatened the Chinese border at the Yalu River, China's leader, Mao Zedong, secured the support of his ally, the Soviet Union, and decided to commit his army to the defense of the North. A long, hard winter of vicious fighting ensued. While the people of Korea struggled to survive amidst the fighting and the hand-to-hand encounters, tank battles, and artillery exchanges of a soldier's war, the politicians engaged in their own deadly skirmish. The threatened perils of the Cold War between East and West became much more likely when American and Chinese troops began to kill one another on the battlefield. US President Harry Truman sanctioned the use of atomic weapons if necessary, and they were moved to the Japanese island of Okinawa in readiness. Only 5 years after the end of the horror of the Second World War, the world braced itself for a third global conflagration. Using original colour film, fully restored in high definition, much of it never seen before. This is the story of Korea, the Forgotten War, in colour. April 22nd, 1951, just north of the 38th parallel, the line that divides the two Koreas. The United Nations command force that includes US Marines and infantry, British and Commonwealth troops, men from the Turkish Army Command Force, and the Army of the South, the ROK, are facing yet another onslaught as the fifth phase offensive of the Chinese Volunteer Army and the North's NKPA begins. Fought out amidst the mountains and valleys of Korea's hinterland, it's one of the most vicious periods of the war. Yi Tok-chin, a school teacher in the south, the Ridge of Blood.
I am looking at a scene of slaughter now. Earth and sky alike swoon at the deafening roar of cannon. But the dove-white 1-11 height is resplendent in the rising sun. How cavalier is the moment that separates the living from the dead. Flesh bursts and blood spurts, and streams of crimson dye the surrounding valleys red. The landscape changes as corpses pile up, and the witch becomes a bloodthirsty devil.
By late May 1951, the opposing forces have fought to a standstill, and the long, drawn-out agony of a military stalemate begins to loom. Although the intensity of the fighting subsides, it continues in smaller skirmishes, and the number of casualties rises relentlessly. The Soviet representative at the United Nations, Jacob Malik, initiates ceasefire negotiations on June 23rd, and on July the 10th, they begin at Kaesong. A captured document from communist forces describes the conditions being endured by their troops on the ground and helps explain their willingness to negotiate.
A shortage of transportation and escort personnel makes it impossible to accomplish the mission of supplying the troops. As a result, our soldiers frequently starve. From now on, the organization of our rear service units should be improved. The troops are hungry. They eat cold food. Some only had 2 potatoes in 2 days. They have no strength for combat. Wounded men cannot be evacuated. The firepower of our entire army is inadequate. When we need our artillery, we have no shells. When we do have shells, many of them are dots.
Sadly, the ceasefire talks in Kaesong do not produce an early breakthrough, or even the prospect of one. The chasm between the two sides is too wide to close. The posturing, disputes and diplomacy will go on for another 2 years. All the while, the fighting continues. The casualty figures for the armed forces of both sides rise inexorably, while the civilian population, north and south, caught in the midst of battles, air raids, and indiscriminate acts of brutality, pays an even higher price. It will be a long and agonizing 2 years. July 1951, Yangbu, South Korea. In the same week as ceasefire negotiations begin at Kaesong, US-led UNC forces are supplied with the latest morale-boosting firepower. the finest in Hollywood showbiz. Jack Benny and his entertainment troupe provide the music, while screen idol Errol Flynn is the star turn. Later in the year, Danny Kaye and Monica Lewis top the bill. Throughout the summer and early autumn of 1951, what had been a war of rapid advance and retreat for both sides during the previous year becomes an attritional stalemate. The communist delegation suspends the ceasefire negotiations on August 23rd, claiming UNC troop encroachments close to the site of the talks at Kaesong. Many of the battle sites are given emotive names by UNC soldiers: Heartbreak Ridge, Punch Bowl, Bloody Ridge, as the fighting more and more resembles the trench warfare of the First World War. Eight divisions of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army dig into well-fortified covered trenches with bunkers and entrenched heavy artillery positions. General Pak Sun-yop, commander of the South's ROK, 1st Division.
The UN command recaptured the crucial Punch Bowl area from the enemy, but paid a heavy price in blood. The fighting proved costly, because the truce talks had provided communist forces time to reorganize their units and harden their positions. The UNC paid an horrendous price as a result.
The Chinese and North Korean armies are exhausted after the brutal warfare of the previous months, and in late October, China initiates new ceasefire negotiations. A neutral position between the opposing forces is chosen at Panmunjom, a village only 10 kilometers east of the site of previous talks at Kaesong. A small detachment of military police is allowed to oversee the site. The People's Republic of China provides a tent, and the United States agrees to provide flooring, light, and heat. 4 hydrogen balloons are flown to mark the neutral zone. By the end of November, a de facto 1-month truce has begun. As the autumn of 1951 turns to winter, both sides take stock, replenish their forces and supply lines, and hope for a breakthrough across the negotiating table. The truce does not survive the winter, and the South's General Pak opens Operation Rat Killer in the peninsula's southwest to try to eliminate communist guerrillas operating there. Pak Sun-yop.
Communist guerrillas
had been a growing cancer in Korea since liberation from Japan at the end of World War II. Winter presented the optimum conditions for success. The absence of foliage and a layer of snow robbed the guerrillas of concealment.
Through a combination of ruthless military action and aid for the civilian population, the operation is largely successful by the end of January 1952. Little progress is made at the Panmunjom talks. The main stumbling block concerns the repatriation of prisoners of war. The North's position, supported by China, is that prisoners are to be returned to the army units they were in at the time of capture. The South and the UNC want the prisoners to decide on their destination. Amidst accusations of mistreatment and brutality on both sides, the issue will hamper the talks for months to come. The talks are also obstructed by the emergence of the controversial issue of germ warfare. The Minister of Foreign Affairs for North Korea, Lee Dong-hyun.
Violating all principles of human morality, the American interventionists are making widespread use of such barbarous and inhuman weapons of mass destruction as napalm and other chemical and biological weapons. From 28 January to 25 March 1952, bacterial weapons were used over 400 times. This included drops of infected insects. These acts have been confirmed by captured American airmen.
As the relevant information on covert military activity during the Korean War is still classified in US archives, the accusations remain unverified. February 1952, Sintan-ri, North Korea. Frontline troops are preparing for the anticipated spring offensives. Everyone fears another summer of bitter fighting, ridge to ridge, hill to hill. David Pak, a Korean translator with the UNC forces.
We have had enough of this war. Almost 2 years, and the situation is exactly as it was when the communists attacked. Except tens of thousands have died on both sides, and our country is in ruins. Is there any hope? It doesn't look good. The men at the negotiating table are stubborn politicians dressed as soldiers. They won't mind sacrificing men to win more concessions.
In March 1952, General Lemuel Shepard, commander of the US Marine Corps within the UNC, makes a tour of Seoul, the South Korean capital. Another long winter has produced major hardships for the civilian population in both North and South Korea. Both governments are conscious that the morale of non-combatants is as critical as the well-being of fighting men. The use of helicopters by United States forces within the United Nations Command is an innovation in a war zone. The rugged terrain of Korea is ideally suited to the helicopter's maneuverability. They are used for observation, evacuation, rescue, transport, and minesweeping. During the Korean conflict, UNC helicopters carry out over 10,000 medical evacuations from the battlefield. Their presence becomes emblematic of many conflicts to come. Late June 1952, a huge force of the North Chinese People's Volunteer Army is attempting to retake Hill 266, Old Baldy, to its UNC defenders. The UNC eventually gives way, but throughout the summer, Old Baldy changes hands several times. It is an exchange of territory typical of the meat grinder of a war that Korea has become. August, Hill 122, nicknamed Bunker Hill by UNC forces. It is becoming one of the most contested pieces of ground in the entire war. UNC headquarters estimates that it is facing over 1 million Chinese and North Korean men along the front line of the war, a line now known as the main line of resistance. The battle for the ridges and valleys of Korea's northern hinterland resumes with the same intensity as in previous years. Both sides need major logistical support, and UNC countries, particularly the United States, use their vast resources to improve the conditions for their troops on the ground. The battles are often a contrast between long-range artillery and airstrikes and hand-to-hand trench warfare. Casualties continue to escalate on both sides. However, one of the features of the Korean conflict, certainly from the perspective of UNC forces, is the enhanced level of medical care for wounded soldiers. The innovation of mobile army surgical hospitals, MASH units, close to the battlefield, and the rapid evacuation of injured men to offshore hospital ships saves many lives and sets a benchmark for all future theatres of war. Kim Moo-woo, a captain of the South's ROK Capital Division, attached to a battalion of US Marines at Outpost Siberia.
I was hit on Siberia. It was a very hot day, and all I could feel was the hot sun burning the wound on my leg. The medics got to me quickly and pumped me full of painkillers. I didn't remember much after that, except being strapped onto the copter. That was even more terrifying than the battlefield. I woke up out at sea in a US hospital ship, and before long, I was in a military hospital in Busan. They couldn't save my leg, but they saved my life.
September 17th, 1952. South Korea's President Syngman Rhee is presenting UNC Commander of the United States Marine Corps, General Lemuel Shepard, with a Korean Medal of Honor. Rhee has recently been re-elected as president for a second term and continues to rule the South with an iron fist. However, he is also able to turn his hand to gentler pursuits. and pen poetic reflections of the war. At the Chong'an Pavilion in Kansong, Syngman Rhee.
I'm standing on the eastern edge of the peninsula. All the hills in sight look like the divine peaks of legend. Wasn't it here that youth sent by Jin Shi Huang looked for the elixir of life? And when was it that Emperor Wu of Han China dreamed of this power? Aren't those the green hills of Yemek outside the gate? And isn't the crimson sun rising above the terrace the sun of pure? Amidst the war, no one claims this superb landscape. It is left to fishermen and white girls.
The beginning of autumn, 1952. There is still no real progress at the ceasefire talks, and the fighting on the battlefield continues unabated. Men on the ground on both sides are now fighting for territory to improve the bargaining power of their comrades at the negotiating table. In this instance, territory can be a matter of a few kilometers either way. It has become the kind of war hated by all soldiers, a war fought by politicians rather than fighting men. Pak Sun-yop, now the newly appointed Chief of Staff of the South's ROK, reflects on the ferocity of the fighting.
The enemy that had fought with such a ferocity now vanished like fog under a burning sun. A solemn spectacle spread out before me. Countless enemy bodies were piled up at the bottom of every hill. The stench of rotting flesh assaulted the nostrils. NKPA artillery pieces, T-34s, were strewn all over the battlefield. I have no idea what the face of hell looks like, but it can't be more hideous than the battlefield before me.
October 26, 1952. As the Korean War moves towards another long winter, UNC forces face a major onslaught by Chinese troops and the NKPA. The fighting focuses on the Battle of the Hook, a 4-mile ridge to the northwest of the confluence of the Imjin and Samichon rivers. The Flower, by Pak Yang-kyun, an officer in the South's ROK.
At whose request have you blossomed on this wasteland, where man slaughtered man? You nameless flower that confronts the sky with your fragile sweetness. How can you, a delicate plant standing upon your fragile stalk on a sunny road beneath blue heaven, efface with your ineffable smile the deafening din of cannons and bombs, and the screams and bloodbaths that shook the earth to its core?
Gojedo, an island off the south coast of Korea, 50 kilometers from Busan. It is the location of the UNC's largest prisoner of war camp, home to over 50,000 Communist forces, POWs. Gojedo is difficult to control and has been the scene of several uprisings. One of the riots had led to the capture of the camp's commandant, Brigadier General Francis Dodd. His release was agreed after American forces signed a document admitting to the mistreatment of prisoners, a confession that was later withdrawn. The issue of prisoners of war will dominate the Korean conflict until the end of hostilities. November 8th, a medal ceremony presided over by ROK Colonel Kim Sung. Yun Chi, the wife of a soldier in the South's ROK.
We are so proud of our men, but also sad. The fighting goes on, and more Koreans are dying. As for the foreigners, I don't understand. It is hard for us to accept the sacrifice of our sons and husbands, but how do their loved ones accept the loss of their men in a foreign land?
Christmas Day, 1952. Cardinal Francis Spellman, the United States senior prelate, is saying Mass. The service offers a moment of reflection for weary soldiers and the chance to pray that 1953 will see the bloody conflict on the Korean peninsula come to an end. Sadly, even as Mass is being celebrated, the fighting continues on the hillsides nearby. (1953) begins with UNC forces preparing for another long and arduous year of conflict. The United States' willingness to commit seemingly inexhaustible material to the UNC cause and in support of the South is beginning to place a huge strain on communist resources in Pyongyang and Beijing. The diary of a senior officer in the NKPA, Kim Chung.
American reinforcements arrive all the time. More importantly, their armor and ammunition is constantly being replaced. We are throwing more and more men at them, but our losses and those of our brave Chinese comrades are huge. They fight well, Americans, British, Turks, Australians. They are all experienced soldiers. We need the Russians and their Red Army.
Incheon, February 1953. The cause of Korean President Syngman Rhee in the South continues to be enhanced by foreign aid, particularly from the United States. While the North suffers increasing hardship, exacerbated by the effects of US-led UNC bombing raids, the economy in the South is supported by the war effort and the influx of aid. However, beneath the gloss of the colour film shot by UNC cameramen, life in the midst of war is still grim. Author Connie Kang remembers her childhood during the war in her book, The Land of Morning Calm.
Power and water cuts were routine occurrences. We used kerosene lamps and stood in line for hours with buckets to draw water from a public water pipe. People fought to get ahead in line. Sometimes we cooked food in water drawn from the sea. We did our laundry with sewer water from a ditch that came from a public bathhouse. And there was the nightly routine of delicing ourselves. picking at the lice buried in the folds of our clothes, like monkeys in a zoo, then wiping our fingernails clean with newspaper scraps.
Although life in the south is dismal, there are signs of hope. Spring in Wartime by Syngman Rhee.
The whole peninsula is wrapped in battle smoke, and Chinese flags and the sails of Western ships hide the spring sky. All who come and go are homeless vagabonds, and they are all fasting, like gods that shun food. Of the citadel, only the ancient walls remain, and farmers are burning forests to make farmland. The spring wind does not wait for the war to cease, and new grass is sprouting all around the ruined citadel.
Even in the darkest hours of the war, there are reminders of the indomitable spirit of the Korean people. In the most traumatic of circumstances, people endeavor to live normal lives. Children go to school, their parents hoping that their innocence will protect them from the horrors of war. Panmunjom, the ceasefire negotiations, 1953. The seemingly endless talking continues. However, the end of the deadlock on the Korean peninsula is about to be heralded by events in Moscow. On March 25, 1953, the news is released that Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, is dead. Stalin had convinced himself that a Third World War was inevitable and believed that any compromise in the Korean conflict would, in turn, weaken the position of the communist bloc. He also believed that it served the long-term interests of the Soviet Union that the United States and its allies exhaust their resources of men and equipment in defending South Korea against his Chinese and North Korean allies, rather than against men of his own Red Army. After Stalin's death, the new regime in Moscow, led by Malenkov, Molotov and Khrushchev, decides on a less confrontational stance towards the United States and its Western allies. There is relief in Beijing and Pyongyang. Their forces are exhausted and they are prepared to compromise. Suddenly, peace is a possibility. Chinese Foreign Minister Zhou Enlai announces on March 30th that he will accept a previously rejected proposal that prisoners of war who are unwilling to be repatriated can be released to a neutral state, where their final destination can be decided. Consequently, several thousand sick and wounded POWs are exchanged in Operation Little Switch in late April and early May. Munsan-ni, North Korea, 1953. Although some serious skirmishes continue and UNC bombing raids on the north persist, events begin to move quickly towards peace. On July 27, 1953, an armistice is signed and tens of thousands of POWs are released in Operation Big Switch. In November, the new United States Vice President, Richard Nixon, visits Korea. He and the new president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, will continue to wrestle with the perils of the Cold War throughout their time in office. Unbeknown to him, for Nixon, his Korean experience is the precursor of another Asian conflict in Vietnam that he will face during his own presidency 15 years later. The world had stood on the brink of atomic war, but has managed to survive. Sadly, there will be many more close calls in the years to come. Ironically, the status quo on the Korean peninsula that existed prior to the outbreak of war returns. I Ask You, by poet and schoolteacher Yu Chi-hwan.
The vast ocean swells and rolls to the east, and the Taebaek Range winds endlessly to the west. In the bright silence in between, at every bend and corner, trenches dug for man to spring at man lurk like reptiles. You mountains and ocean, tell me if you can. What's the point?
At the Panmunjom Armistice line, Syngman Rhee and the people of the South stare across the divide at their Korean kith and kin, Kim Il-sung and the people of the North. Kim Il-sung will continue to rule North Korea for another 41 years, until his death in 1994, when he will be succeeded by his son, Kim Jong-il. In a speech to mark the 50th anniversary of the formation of the NKPA, the North Korean Army, in 1982, Kim Il-sung.
Our revolutionary armed forces have strengthened our solidarity. They have won a famous victory in the Fatherland Liberation War against the US imperialists. A toast to their health and the revolution.
Syngman Rhee will serve 4 terms as President of the South. However, in April 1960, popular protests will force him to flee the country, to live in exile until his death in 1965. In a private letter to John Chang, the Korean ambassador to the United States, Syngman Rhee.
Weakness and appeasement in the face of aggressive designs always lead to more and more aggression. Only those who dare to be strong deserve to be free. Our greatest hope must always lie in our own unaided determination to resist and to fight to the death for our liberties.
The strident views of the 2 protagonists reflect an ideological chasm, implacable and ominous, that will endure in Korea for decades to come. At Tori 1 by poet and academic Zhou Ji-Huan.
The war, which was so cruel, blew away like a rainstorm, leaving huts crumpled and houses with burned thatched roofs. Today I passed this ruined and charred village, stepping casually. The only thing that heaven has spared is an old clay pot on a shelf, reminding me that I, like the clay pot, have been spared. The villagers who have returned look up from the ruins toward the distant hills. The sky is as blue as ever in the autumn sun of Dorion. A fragile cosmos shivers in the breeze.